Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. It looks like a lot of familiar faces here. For those who are new, I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director, and we're delighted to have you here this evening. We are a lively community. Hopefully you could tell, people talking to each other even as we waited to start. We are a lively community of learners, of people who are invested and engaged with our city, with our history, with our culture and arts, with our built environment, who love to get together for music and arts and programs, conversation and coffee and good books. And we invite you, if you're not a member, to become a part of our community. If you are a member, hopefully you got your email today that we have just started our spring appeal. We've received a matching gift offer of $25,000 and hoping that our members and friends will help support so we can get that full $25,000 this year. So please look for that in your email and support us. But tonight, we're excited. This is the program which, if you look at what's around our walls here about paint brands from the 19th century, tonight's topic fits in really well with our collections here, architectural collections here at the Athenaeum. Speaking tonight is Jennifer Black, who's an historian of visual and material culture with a particular focus on the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States. She holds a PhD in American History and Visual Studies from the University of Southern California, as well as an MA in Public History and a BA in Art History from Western Michigan University. Her research examines the ways in which people interact with images and objects and the power of visual and material culture to influence trends in politics, the law, and society. In addition to teaching a variety of courses in American history, public history, and visual culture, she serves as book reviews editor for H Material Culture and on the board of editors for Enterprise and Society. She also has experience working as a public historian, including work for large and small public institutions such as the National Museum for Women in the Arts in Washington, D.C., and has served as an historical consultant for clients such as the American Society of Mechanical Engineers and Cengage Learning. And we're delighted to have Jen Black here today to talk about Philadelphia and the origins of modern advertising. I invite you to join me in warmly welcoming Jen Black to the Athenaeum of Philadelphia.
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to all of you for coming out on this dreary evening. I'm delighted to be here. I was very excited to have been asked, and I'm excited to talk to you about Philadelphia and branding this evening. So I'd like to start with a story of a man named Daniels Carpenter. Daniels Carpenter was a War of 1812 veteran who found himself in a tricky predicament in the winter of 1843. He had been down on his luck for nearly a decade and had been working in a thread factory to make ends meet in Foxborough, Massachusetts. As a gripping nor'easter blanketed the region in snow in March 1843, Daniels Carpenter received word that he was being sued for counterfeiting cotton sewing threads in the state of New York. Before the year was over, he would be named in 2 additional lawsuits, both of which landed in the federal court in Boston, much to his poor luck. Reflecting on his situation, he might have wondered how he had gotten here. In many ways, his experience had been fairly typical for young men in the generation after the Revolution. In the 1820s, Daniels Carpenter had built a successful commercial farm, growing straw for the region's hats factories around Foxborough, Massachusetts. The booming American economy must have seemed boundless, and as a young man, Carpenter took every opportunity to get ahead. But the 1830s had been quite difficult for him, leaving him scrambling. Carpenter attempted to diversify his incomes by investing in a thread factory, but dumb luck had him signing the papers just as the economy crashed in 1837. Thankfully, he'd been able to sell his interest in 1839 and retain a position for himself. 3 years later, he spotted an opportunity for redemption. The threads sold by his employer in Foxborough were struggling to compete with the more popular thread lines from England. The British were, after all, very well known for their textiles, and the public was willing to pay a premium price for the high-quality products. Scrutinizing the labels for Taylor's Persian threads and J&P Coates threads, Carpenter probably marveled at the symbolic importance of such a tiny piece of paper. Remarkably, this round label turned a banal spool of thread into a luxury commodity. The women about town asked for it by name in the dry goods stores, and that made it very hard for the local manufacturers to break into the market. But Carpenter had an idea. He had heard of a lithographer in Boston who would take commission orders for reproductions, and if he could get those labels printed in Boston, he could attach them to the threads produced by the local mill in Foxborough. Of course, the lithographer would have to be very skilled to produce the visually distinct British labels, and he would have to be discreet as well. But the plan came together surprisingly easy in 1842. Daniels Carpenter used his connections to procure the labels and cases of unmarked threads. He then secured a commission agent in Boston and another one in New Jersey, who helped him funnel his fraudulently labeled goods through wholesalers and into retail stores in Boston and New York. It might have seemed almost too easy. The labels he scored from the lithographer matched the genuine products perfectly, and the popularity and reputation of the British products made it very easy to sell his fakes at a discount. If everything had gone smoothly, Carpenter could have made thousands of dollars, surely enough to rebuild his farm. But as the snow drifted down in 1843, he realized he'd been caught. He would spend the next 3 years stalling the court's actions, dodging further prosecution, and relentlessly appealing his cases, only to lose miserably. He couldn't have known that his actions would set in motion a long and tedious battle over the value of trademarks in American commerce. But Carpenter's story, and forgive me for the pun, weaves together two threads in American society and two threads that are at the center of my book: the growing importance of trademarks and reputation to America's commercial market, and the centrality of visual images in communicating to the public. My book, Branding Trust, examines these interconnected storylines, explaining the cultural work of advertising media and constructing personal connections between producers and consumers. The book looks at the complex interactions of advertising professionals, their clients, and the public. As many of these exchanges took place in print, printers and newspaper editors also played an important role in mediating advertisers' interactions with the public. Visual and material culture assisted these professionals in constructing and communicating their white middle-class identities, which they used to build rapport with customers and boost their sales. These strategies, I argue, prefigured modern branding techniques. Carpenter's story also helps to explain why these developments happened when they did. The decades after the Revolution were an exciting time of opportunity and growth for the United States, but the economy was still young and rather unstable. There was very little federal regulation, and the period saw regular booms and busts punctuating life. Dreams of making it big created opportunities for fraud, and without someone keeping watch, many frauds thrived. The chilling ease with which Carpenter orchestrated his counterfeit scheme helps to explain why many Americans, especially those in the middle class, worried about status and appearances in this period. A person might be only one big con or one poor investment away from bankruptcy. Advertisers were aware of this, and they tried to use language and visual cues that would reassure consumers and gain their trust. And that brings me to the first advertising agent in the United States, Volney Palmer. He understood these problems in American society, especially people's hesitance to trust people they didn't know. If you were a manufacturer in Philadelphia, for example, How could you convince consumers in northeastern PA that your products were worth buying? Volney Palmer helped to bridge relationships between these groups of people. His business was based on linking together people in different regions using a network of relationships that he built with local newspaper editors. Born in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania in 1799, Volney Palmer spent his childhood and teens helping his father with the family newspaper business. Around the time he was 30, he moved with his brother to Pottsville, PA, and started working in the coal industry, first as a sales agent for a coal company, and then as a secretary-treasurer for 3 different canal companies. These canals helped to funnel the coal from the anthracite region down to Philadelphia for sale and shipping across the world. By this time, Volney's parents had moved to New Jersey, and his mother would take over the family newspaper business when his father passed away. All of these experiences helped Volney Palmer understand that newspapers and shipping channels were 2 important industries that could be leveraged for future profit. As I mentioned, the 1820s and 1830s were a booming time in the United States. There was a lot of opportunity to buy land, invest in businesses, and make a quick buck. But like other entrepreneurs at the time, Palmer's business suffered during the Panic of 1837, which plunged the United States into an economic depression that saw the unemployment rate skyrocket. By 1840, Palmer had to sell his home and everything in it in Lancaster, and he moved to Philadelphia, opening a real estate office and a coal office, and he soon began placing notices in local newspapers offering to help urban wholesalers and manufacturers reach rural merchants by advertising in the country papers outside the city. By this point, Volney Palmer had done a lot of legwork to set up a network of newspaper clients. He contracted with over 20 newspapers in the rural areas around Philly, each of them authorizing him as their agent for selling subscriptions and advertising space. Palmer's aim was to connect rural editors with urban manufacturers and wholesalers. In many ways, it was a win-win for both sides of the equation. Rural editors needed advertising revenues, and they could offer the attention of customers eager for new goods. And they tried to reach out to urban firms who were equally eager for new customer bases. But editors in the rural areas and urban manufacturers and wholesalers, on the other hand, these 2 groups were reluctant to engage each other in business because they didn't know each other. The boom and bust nature of the economy meant frequent failures and turnovers, especially in banking, manufacturing, and publishing. Many businesses hired agents who would travel around and meet new business partners and make sure that they were trustworthy. But these kinds of agents meant additional staff to pay, and only the largest firms could afford to hire such agents. Palmer, therefore, offered to serve this role as a middleman agent for both urban wholesalers and manufacturers on the one hand, and rural newspaper editors on the other. So how did his business work? His basic role was to contract with rural newspaper editors, writing letters to them to establish a relationship. He purchased advertising space in their newspapers on consignment. From his Philly office, he sold the advertising space in their newspapers to urban manufacturers and distributors looking to expand their markets. He took a 25% sales commission for his services and then forwarded the payments and advertisements back to the country papers, probably asking to purchase more space, but on consignment. This service promised to be beneficial for both of his client groups, as I already mentioned. Helping urban firms reach new markets, Palmer offered country newspapers valuable advertising revenue, while consumers in rural areas would grow more aware of the industrial goods increasingly available to them through canals. After only 4 years, Palmer's business was thriving, and he had opened additional offices in Baltimore, Boston, and New York. And this is why Philadelphia was central to this story, because it offered a unique geographic position in the framework of canals and networks that Palmer was able to build. So how did he convince people to use his services? In some cases, he made sales calls directly to manufacturers in the city, offering to establish a relationship, and then trying to win their confidence. But he also found ways to convey his trustworthiness in print. He used formal language which presented himself as an educated businessman. He, quote, respectfully invited potential clients to visit his office and look over his files, attempting to signal his honesty and transparency to others. He also offered evidence that advertising could help bring additional profits, promising that using his services would be beneficial to his clients' businesses. He showed this evidence by having newspaper editors provide testimonials of the value of his service. These glowing testimonials worked like reference letters for Volney Palmer. People tended to trust their local newspaper editors, and having those testimonials in your corner would be very valuable. But in other ways, it was access to his network of client newspapers that he was really offering to sell. So as much as we could argue that Volney Palmer revolutionized the advertising industry and established foundations and frameworks and strategies that would prove successful for the next century in terms of using testimonials and establishing valuable networks of clients whose credit relationships he could then leverage for new clients, in many ways, the network itself was what he was trying to sell. It was access to that network. His business connections with rural newspaper editors in and of themselves became a valuable product that he could mobilize and drum up additional advertising revenues. Palmer built his network through the emerging distribution channels in Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, the canals. An important technological achievement in their time, canals offered more efficient transportation than stagecoaches and freight wagons. The largest and most famous of these was, of course, the Erie Canal, which opened in 1825. The Erie Canal offered a speedier and more direct route to the Great Lakes from New York, reducing shipping times by more than half, and freight charges dropped by 90%. In Pennsylvania, canal building began in 1797 and expanded to the extent that the state could boast one of the most extensive canal systems in the United States by 1820. Counting over 1,200 miles, or roughly 40% of the total canal mileage for the entire country. The Commonwealth funded a great deal of these projects, spending almost $40 million on the construction and maintenance of canals, and that's not a figure I've adjusted for inflation. These projects were motivated by a desire to increase trade, especially around Philadelphia. Exports from Philly to its surrounding counties grew rapidly after 1820 as the state continued to invest in canals, accelerating a consumer revolution that was already underway in the United States. These new transportation routes connected manufacturers with merchants, wholesalers, and distributors, as I've mentioned. The expanding network of canals in and around Pennsylvania provided the critical infrastructure that allowed Palmer's business to grow and thrive. Many of his early clients were established along canal routes, and I'm showing you some of them here. The purple dots are his clients in various places, and the blue lines on the map are the canals, and this is as of 1840. These canals connected county seats in the developing region with the bustling urban centers, the bustling urban centers along the eastern seaboard. And through the canals in Pennsylvania and New York alone, Palmer could promise access to New York, western Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, Toronto, Detroit, Chicago, and even Kenosha, Wisconsin, on the western shores of Lake Michigan. Once in Wisconsin, a traveler or a teamster could find transport across the state along a new railroad that was completed by 1845 and gain access to the upper byways of the Mississippi. By 1858, Palmer counted well over 150 clients across Pennsylvania and the East Coast, with some as far-flung as Fayette, Missouri, Burlington, Iowa, and New Orleans, Louisiana. In roughly 15 years, he had built an extensive media network that connected consumer readers in rural locations through the East and the developing Midwest with urban manufacturers in the Mid-Atlantic. He put Philadelphia on the map as a manufacturing center, and he established Philadelphia as the center of the advertising world in the 1840s. He leveraged access to this network to promote his services, demonstrating the scale and scope of his network when he advertised his own business. He quantified the benefits of employing the nation's expanding distribution system through his advertising network. And I'm going to, forgive me for nerding out for a moment here. This animated map took me about a month to produce. What you're looking at here is a spatially and temporally ordered map that shows you when Palmer accumulated his clients by date. So the lightest dots on the map show up first, and then the darker they go, those are the later clients that are added to his network. These efforts to build and leverage a commercial network, as I mentioned, laid the groundwork for later commercial distribution and advertising in the latter 19th century. Subsequent leaders in the advertising industry, such as George Rowell and J. Walter Thompson, recognized the importance of Volney Palmer's early media network, and they found ways to further capitalize on its value when they promoted their services to clients. The remainder of my book, that's just the first couple chapters, the remainder of my book traces the ways in which Palmer's methods of demonstrating character and reputation in print kicked off a century of advertising innovation in the United States. Part of this innovation included finding ways to attract the reader's eye in order to grab their attention and to get them to read the advertisements. In newspapers, posters, billboards, and other ephemera, printers created increasingly elaborate designs for advertising. Newspaper editors had long understood the importance of including catchy images and designs in the ad section. In his Pennsylvania Gazette, Ben Franklin included interesting borders, headers in all caps, and other visual elements to make certain that the ads would stand out from other objects on the page. In the decades that followed the Revolution, we can see a steady growth in the use of interesting visual elements in newspaper advertising. By the 1830s, advertisers were shifting the margins of their ads, creating white space and designs to draw attention to the text. Others inserted custom images onto the newspaper column. For example, the owner of Hovey's Trunk Repository inserted a woodcut of his storefront in an 1841 issue of the New York Tribune. That's the example on your right. While the manufacturers of Lee's Blackening and Magnolia shaving soaps included circular logo-like images in the same paper. And I'm showing you Lee's boot blacking there on the left. These advertisers used the black and white medium of newsprint to their advantage. They created pictures that would stand out from the rest of the newspaper page. Others cleverly used woodblock type to create relief images around their texts, as in this advertisement for Hayes Liniment in the September 29th issue of the New York Herald in 1838. This is a wooden type. It's a new innovation for the mid-1830s, and wooden type provided some greater flexibility in terms of design potential. It was also cheaper, given the abundant supply of raw materials and the easily carved surface of wooden blocks over cast or die-cast metal type. This particular relief text is known as a streamer. It was an American invention in the mid-1830s, and the printers would take the block and hollow out the form around the letter to create this black background with the white letter, and then join letters together with wax to hide the joints between each block of text so that cured pops out. On this page, the streamer successfully draws your eye, I would suggest, obscuring other modes of appeal on the same page that might have otherwise worked. If we look very closely at the page, you can see a few miniature woodblock prints adorning the ads to the far right, notably a hat, a ship, and a house. To the left of the streamer, a larger image of a ship appears. Tiny pointing hands, called manicules, they look like this, also appear throughout the page, attempting to draw the reader's eye, but these images aren't as successful, I would argue, as the streamer. Outside of New York, advertisers used similar tactics to create commercial messages that stood apart on the newspaper page. But newspaper editors showed perhaps more flexibility in accommodating a greater variety of typefaces and designs. Variable font selections, bold lettering, italics, and shifting margins are all common in these newspapers, as they were in the New York papers. But in the papers outside of the city, a greater variety of font selections can be seen. Most likely, these incorporated newly devised woodblock type, which, as I noted, provided more decorative options. For example, in this December 1837 ad in the Columbia Democrat, C.B. Fisher used at least 7 different fonts to advertise his dry goods store. Working within the confines of the newspaper page, he used the tools at his disposal in an attempt to create visual interest and draw your attention, including a small woodblock print as well as a bold headline and italic text. But his tactics weren't really that much different from others on the page. There are several woodcut prints. I don't have the page here, but the page includes a variety of these similar elements. Aside from woodcuts and variable fonts, other merchants played with the orientations of their ads, shifting the text or rotating the ad to create visual interest. Occasionally, advertisements appeared to be flipped 90 degrees in the column so that a text or image would be read sideways. It's likely that these kinds of insertions occurred out of necessity, such as when a merchant gave an editor a woodblock cut that wouldn't fit within the confines of the ruled page, and so they had to turn it sideways. But regardless, the end result still serves, I would suggest, to draw your attention. It's weird, and so you're drawn to look at it. Even on a page with a fair amount of interesting variety, ads turned sideways successfully stand out from the rest, as in this 1845 ad for John Silbin's shoe shop. Incorporating a woodcut print and an alternative font, his ad reminds viewers to find him at the sign of the big shoe. But in 1847, James Bennett, who was the editor of the New York Herald, banned advertising imagery in his newspaper. There are a few reasons why he did this, and historians sort of argue about it, but the biggest reason I would suggest is that he could get more revenue this way. Images took up more space on the page, and they were usually paid for at a flat rate. He began charging by the word for advertisements. So if he banned images, which were a flat rate, and instead charged by the word, you could fit far more words in the same space that an image would take up in an advertisement. His move was copied by other newspapers in New York City, and it reflected a broader trend among other major urban newspapers in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and even London. As a result, most of the New York papers in the 1850s demonstrate a reversal of their trend to incorporate more visually interesting elements. Unlike the papers of the 1840s, which allowed some freedom to use variable fonts and images, the New York papers of the 1850s are remarkably uninteresting in their visual presentation of advertising material. Even still, some advertisers found ways to use creative text that would turn the page itself into a visual assortment of eye-catching shapes. A clear example of this can be seen in the ads of the famed New York photographer Matthew Brady, whose gallery at 359 Broadway became a popular spot for shoppers and tourists. In this 1856 ad in the New York Times, Brady arranged the text into larger shapes that spelled out his name vertically on the page. He had another one in the New York Tribune that spelled his address, 359 Broadway. Manipulating the texts in these ways, printers and advertisers engineered designs that I would argue turned the texts themselves into images. These novelties made the advertising section more entertaining and more appealing overall. But one very interesting thing I found in my research of these developments was that these tactics were uneven and they varied across regional lines. In my research, I compared newspaper advertisements for New York City with rural newspapers in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Ohio, and Vermont. Surprisingly, the rural editors showed much more willingness to incorporate a larger variety of images, fonts and typefaces, and designs. Despite their limited resources, these rural editors demonstrated tremendous innovation. Though we tend to think of Madison Avenue as the center of the advertising industry, New York City was not the epicenter of innovation in the 19th century. Rather, I would argue it was rural newspaper editors in places like Tunkhannock and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, that showed the greatest ingenuity around 1860. Many advertisers flipped their texts and images sideways, but rural editors showed a willingness to allow more of this on a single page. Adding additional space between lines, using bold fonts and catchy headlines, and shifting the margins of one's texts to create cascading designs, these also remained common tactics. But again, rural editors showed more flexibility in allowing a greater variety of this on the page. Images eventually began appearing in larger 2-column sizes and in greater variety and custom scope. I apologize there. I went too fast. As rural newspaper editors continued to allow this variety of designs, New York City newspapers gradually caught on. By the end of the century, we really see a break. The New York Times is very dull and boring, I would suggest, until about the 1870s. And then by the end of the 70s, early 1880s, you see a little bit more and more images like this appearing on the page. And by the 1890s, the New York papers seemed to suddenly burst with images as if advertising had sort of exploded in this decade. But in reality, I would argue that these innovations were steadily moving through the rural editors and gradually made their way back to the cities. So rather than innovation coming from the big cities out, we see the innovation coming from the outside in. Now I can get to the printers. In the 1870s, chromolithographers and other printers began experimenting with small handheld advertisements, which archivists now call trade cards. These cards triggered a collecting craze among Americans of all ages and classes. And this is another element of printers innovating to try to do something different to attract consumers and try to expand appeal for the advertisements they printed. Using images of children, flowers, and other symbols, printers heightened the appeal of these small objects and taught consumers to look at advertisements for entertaining, appealing images. They turned the ads into entertainment. Romanticized, endearing images of children helped to disguise the commercial messages on the page and on the cards, further lending to the emotional and entertaining appeal of these advertising objects. In one such example, the chubby and angelic faces of Lydia Pinkham's grandchildren seem to reference health and happiness, qualities that would probably help validate the manufacturer's claims and reassure consumers of the medicinal benefits of using Lydia Pinkham's vegetable tonic. Here, the cultural symbolism associated with children, including notions of purity, innocence, and virtue, are subtly transferred to the product for sale, if only momentarily. In the 1870s, advertising agencies also innovated fictional spokes characters, figures such as the Quaker Oats Man and Phoebe Snow, who attempted to demonstrate, these figures attempted to demonstrate or humanize the faceless corporation. And again, they created rapport with the public. These sorts of examples help to demonstrate the communicative power of trademarked images in that, when successful, they could fuse personal appeal with celebrity and virtue. And these figures are chosen for their virtuous qualities that are quite apparent, I would suggest, in the images themselves. Miss Snow emerges right around 1890, and her pale alabaster complexion and the beautiful, pure white dress that she wears is doubly symbolic. On the one hand, it signifies the cleanliness, the supposed cleanliness of anthracite coal, in that it burns clean, right? But it also signifies the cleanliness or purity of railroad travel along the Delaware and Lackawanna railroads. So Miss Snow could travel without sullying her dress or her reputation. The Quaker Oatman, of course, is a callback to the William Penn, sort of honest, stereotypical Quaker of the 18th century in his mode of dress. And if you look closely, you can see that the scroll he holds in his left hand says pure. So we're subtly told that here is a figure we can trust. Here is a figure we should honor based on his qualities of reputation and trustworthiness and sincerity. And those qualities are subtly transferred to oats, which the advertisement tells us will make the children strong and rosy, right? They play better, study better, live better, sleep better when they eat Quaker oats. So these efforts to make advertisements more interesting and entertaining also intertwined with a push towards emphasizing the trademark and the brand of a product. The remainder of my book looks at the development of trademark law through the earliest cases, Daniels Carpenter, which I previewed at the beginning of this talk, through 1900. Beginning in the 1840s, judges in American courts continued to refine ideas about what fair competition was. They used cultural ideas about honesty, morality, and a person's character to define the boundaries of trademark infringement and unfair competition. But the boundaries of right and wrong were not always clear. Many defendants argued that their efforts to borrow or closely parallel the trademarks of others should be allowed for a variety of reasons. It was up to the judges in these courts to decide what was really right or wrong. By 1870, we see over 100 lawsuits heard in federal and state courts, and even though the problem of trademark infringement was rather common, a comprehensive federal law regulating trademarks would not come until 1905. I conclude the book with a case study on the National Biscuit Corporation and its tactics to build a brand in the early 20th century. Nabisco positioned its logo as a personal guarantee from the company to the consumer. It combined the language of trustworthiness that Volney Palmer had used earlier in the 19th century with the images that printers knew would be meaningful and entertaining to viewers. At the same time, Nabisco took an aggressive legal campaign to protect its reputation in the courts. By 1906, it had scored approximately 250 victories and injunctions against competitors' products, names, symbols, and labels that infringed on its intellectual property. And here I'm showing you a couple of examples. This is from a really wonderful book that Nabisco produced, quantifying and describing all of the trademark lawsuits that it had won, a sort of like self-congratulatory manual of their cases. And so on the left here, You Need a Biscuit, that's the original Nabisco product. That's their first, it's like a cookie/cracker, like a sweetened cracker. And you can see the Nabisco seal there on the left end, and you might recognize that seal. It's very similar to their trademark today. I Want a Biscuit was the competitor, and believe me, folks, I've seen them all. I want a, she wants a, he wants a, you want a, we need a, I need a. I mean, you name it. On any kind of configuration or mutation of You Need a Biscuit has appeared. The one on the right there, that is a Betta Biscuit, and that's from a trademark lawsuit that Nabisco won against the Pacific Biscuit Corporation in 1914. They were at court with them for over 10 years, fighting against trademark infringement for the name and for the seal, which you can see is a swastika. And the Pacific Biscuit Corporation did not make it past the crash of 1929, but I suspect if they had, that seal wouldn't have continued to been used much longer for obvious reasons. So Nabisco's strategies, that you might call these scare tactics, they would often take up legal action against competitors in an effort to shrink the competition in the market or to edge out competitors in the market. And I would suggest that these strategies worked. After only a few years in business, only 8 years in business, National Biscuit was valued at $55 million in 1906, rising to one of the largest national producers of household foodstuffs in only 8 years, selling approximately 80 million packages annually of biscuits, when approximately only 120 million packages were sold nationwide. So they had garnered for themselves quite a large market share. Importantly, all of this work of building their brand was done by connecting word, image, and cultural meanings to the logo itself. Each repeated iteration of the trademark in newspapers, posters, magazines, and billboards built a layer of familiarity within the viewer's mind. In these ways, the trademark became a visual tool for building brand identity through the consumer's experience in modern society. Branding as we know it had finally arrived. And while printers and ad men had found the strategies to infuse the mark with public trust, lawmakers by 1905 had encoded an inherently visual symbol of reputation, the trademark, with moral symbolism. The 1905 law would, in turn, provide the foundation for future trademark and brand protections in the United States. So while the 1920s has often been held up as the birth of modern advertising by many historians and practitioners, advertising professionals had, in fact, learned how to navigate public relations over the previous century. This development was uneven and gradual, evolving slowly through printers' and advertisers' efforts to appeal to consumers on their own terms. It's only visible when we view the 19th century as a whole, looking for patterns of continuity and transformation. When we stop at the Civil War, we ignore the continuity that takes place between the antebellum and postbellum years. The evolution of branding as a practice was not a hegemonic development spiraling outward from large urban advertising agencies. Instead, it was a collaborative and diffused practice with multiple points of innovation and contingency, involving structural trends in industry and cultural ideas filtered through individuals, including consumers. Advertisements and branding came unevenly. Advancements in branding came unevenly through the 19th century, with several earlier pockets of innovation springing up before the large changes of the 1890s and the rise of the multinational corporation. But gradually and consistently from the 1830s forward, advertisements contributed to what I would call a shared visual experience among American consumers, one that defined the relationship between producers and consumers as one of perceived trust and accountability, in addition to the market relations of capital exchange. This visual rhetoric of trust and legitimacy, established through trademarks and advertising imagery, has become a central component of American consumer society today. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has questions. Yes.
And how does this compare to what was going on in Europe?
In Europe, yes, excellent. Yeah, excellent question. So European advertising emerges in a similar vein. Printers in London and lithographers. So lithography is brought from Germany to the United States. Louis Prang is one of the first chromolithographers in the United States, and he comes as an immigrant from Germany just after the War of 1812 and establishes his shop in Boston. So lithography is advancing, I would say, perhaps at the same, if not a quicker pace in Europe than it is in the United States. Europeans also were very much interested in these little trade cards, these small handheld objects, and for various reasons they declined in Europe around the same time, around the 1890s, end of the 19th century, when they did in the United States. But printing in the newspapers, as I mentioned, was slower to evolve in London, for example, than it was in the United States. And that's largely because of the influence of this James Bennett's rule of the 5.5-point font, which the historians have called the Agate rule. That was a rule followed by the London Times into 1900, whereas the New York Times sort of abandoned this rule by the early 1880s or so. So newspaper advertising in Britain, at least, is slower to evolve if we're looking at the same metrics than it is in the United States. The advertising agencies themselves pop up in different ways in Europe. So a lot of the earlier agents in Europe are not working with newspapers per se, but rather coming out of the theatrical world, theater productions and traveling, circuses isn't the right word, but traveling menageries. And so they're kind of developing their own set of practices, but it's the American agencies that end up establishing the biggest branch offices in places like London and Paris around 1900. So similar, but not quite the same. Yes?
At what point did advertising in mass circulation, weekly magazines with big color spreads take off? I mean, I'm thinking of our neighbor here, the Saturday Evening Post and the building or right by us. When did that get started?
Yeah, so I unfortunately I don't have any images of magazines in this particular talk, but so you'll see mass circulation magazines really proliferating after the Civil War, and part of that is because of postage rate changes. So there's a postal regulation change in the late 1870s, where essentially it becomes cheaper to mail periodicals than it was earlier in the century. And several historians have argued that this helps to kind of generate the rise of the mass circulation magazine, so that by the late 1880s, you're looking at color images on Ladies' Home Journal, for example. But the large scale, like Saturday Evening Post, I think of as it's big, right? Like Look magazine, and that's really a post-World War II invention. Photography isn't able to be used because of limitations in the printing techniques. They're not able to put photography in large magazines until like the 20s or early 30s. So you still have illustrations, but fewer color illustrations at first, and then after 1900 you're going to see more color illustrations, mostly in the advertising section. Yeah.
You described the first guy as sort of selling access to this network.
Volney Palmer, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there was a lot of sort of creative typography. When did the profession of sort of developing brand identity, creating the Quaker Oats guy that you saw there?
So I would argue that I'm going to go all the way back. So these are the fraudulent labels that Benjamin Thayer created for, let's see, it's Coates v. Thayer. Thayer is the printer, but Thayer produced fraudulent labels for J.M.P. Coates threads. This is a lawsuit from 1844. And so I would argue the first lawsuit that I mentioned is Taylor's v. Carpenter. I don't have any images of the Taylor Persian threads, but these were pasted into the handwritten transcript documents in the National Archives in Boston, which was, when I saw the scans, I just about lost it. I had been looking for these kinds of labels for years. So I would argue that as early as the 1840s, we're seeing litigation that is using language of reputation and goodwill. Joseph Story, who heard this case in Boston, he's the same Joseph Story who's the Supreme Court Justice who hears the Amistad case, but he happens to be riding circuit and hearing this case at the time. And it's just unlucky for Daniels Carpenter that two of Carpenter's cases where he's a defendant lands in front of Joseph Story. But Joseph Story in the late 1840s, after deciding these cases, he will write a treatise on goodwill, and he uses the phrase brands when he's talking about product and a kind of corporate identity. And certainly in the 18th century, there are producers who are using what we would now consider a brand identity to market their goods. Josiah Wedgwood, for example, the very famous ceramicist, right, who made Queensware and cream ceramics. marketed them to European aristocrats by sending them samples, and then he would say, this is in, the Queen's, Her Majesty's tableware, right? Like, this is what she puts on her table. And so there are material culture scholars who study the 18th century who know that people in the United States or in the proto-United States, were buying things based on brand identity. There's a wonderful scholar who's up in New England who writes about shoes. Her name is Kimberly Alexander. On Fridays, she tweets about shoes. It's called Foot Candy Friday, and they're the most beautiful shoes you've ever seen from the 18th century. But she talks about how people purchased or sought after Samuel Lane's shoes because it was Samuel Lane, right? Because he had a reputation. And this isn't a person that George Washington knew of, right? He had never met Samuel Lane, but he wrote to him because he knew this is what all the women wanted, and Martha wanted Samuel Lane's shoes. And so he wrote to him in London and ordered them specifically. So Wedgwood also knew the value of his brand, and he actually encouraged knockoffs because he thought it would elevate the value of his genuine goods. So we tend to think of brands as being a modern phenomenon, and I could go on and on about why. That's like a whole nother talk. But I think one of the things I'm trying to push against is that brands have been with us since the beginning of trade in the United States. And certainly when we start to see litigation against competitors because they're infringing on the reputation of the product and of the company, right? They call it goodwill, they call it reputation, they call it a brand. They're here, yeah. Sorry, that was a roundabout way of answering your question. Yes.
Small thing, but I'm curious, do you know anything about symbolism in the marketing? I'm curious.
I do. Yes, so let me go back to find it. So the orb and double cross. The orb and double cross was created by Adolphus Green, who was, the president of the time. So National Biscuit is born of the merger movement in the 1890s. They incorporated in 1898 from a conglomerate of other regional bakeries. And so they really have no longevity or reputation to build upon like Coates Thread or other producers at the time. And so they're kind of starting from scratch and trying to build a reputation. So this inner seal logo is it's crafted by Adolphus Green, who's the president, working with N.W. Ayer and Son, who is they take over for Volney Palmer in his Philadelphia advertising agency. So N.W. Ayer and Son are the next biggest agency. And the double cross and orb is meant to signify kind of heaven and earth. So it's a joining of the otherworldly and the worldly. The heavenly is the kind of double cross coming down, and it's the orb is the earth, and it's meant to kind of signify purity in a sort of divine way. And they put seal there because it was a reference to the wax packaging that was underneath. So part of their company lore is that they revolutionized cracker buying in the United States, because prior to National Biscuit, you would have to go into your dry goods store and, take out the shovel and scoop them out of a barrel where, there's any kind of number of environmental contaminants, right? There's a story in a company history that talks about, mice sleeping in the Cracker Barrel every night, and the dry goods store man says, "That's impossible, there couldn't be mice in the Cracker Barrel. My cat sleeps on top of the barrel every night," right? So the idea that, you're getting like just, environmental contaminants, dust, dirt, the smell of kerosene, because whatever else is in the shop. And so these are packaged in a cardboard box with a wax seal, like wrapped up in wax paper and then sealed with a red wax seal on the end. So that's the kind of practical symbolism, but it's an old printer's mark from the 14th or 15th century. Adolphus Green got it out of a mark of printers' books, Italian printers. Yeah. So like you may have seen something like this if you look at like early modern manuscripts. Yes. Yeah. I think that certainly by the mid-20th century, you see this proliferation of American production. And there are a whole host of reasons why, right? We could talk about post-war manufacturing boom, the culture of abundance, the kind of just extemporaneous discussion of consumption in the United States that is certainly very much within that time period of Madison Avenue in the mid-20th century. But I actually don't think that the logo was an American invention. It may have proliferated in the United States in the 20th century, and certainly through mid-century designers. Saul Bass is one of my favorite designers. He designed Container Corporation and AT&T and Girl Scouts logo, like some of these like really famous logos, GE, you know. So, oh no, he didn't do GE, scratch that. But he did do Container Corporation and AT&T and Girl Scouts. So, you know, we tend to think of this as kind of like the age of logos. But again, I would argue that these earlier producers, and it's no coincidence, right, that the first lawsuits in the United States, these are British thread manufacturers, right? And so it may not be as exciting as the Nabisco logo, but it is a logo, and it is used as such to signify the corporation and its reputation and the kind of branding that it's cultivating for itself. And certainly as a legal mark, it then kind of contains all of these meanings. So I think I would split hairs between when does a logo appear and when does the culture of logos really proliferate. And certainly the mid-20th century, I think, is when you see the kind of cultural emphasis on logos, right? And certainly logos and personal identity. You know, like, I'm from Detroit. We buy Corvettes, right? Or Cadillacs. You make it big, you buy a Cadillac. Like, that's what you do. Because it's a Cadillac, right? Yeah.
What you're saying about personal logos reminds me of how in the 18th century, some Americans would order cake, they'd order china from China, like cake put Mars on. So maybe that's like a precursor.
Yeah, like it's a prestige thing, right? So they're kind of manufacturing a heritage for themselves. Yeah, because the symbol has meaning. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you.
Is the word brand that derived from animal branding?
It is, yeah. The word brand is derived from animal branding and slave branding. Yeah, of burning the mark into the physical. Yeah, but I mean, winemakers and alcohol distributors in the early modern period also branded their casks with, wood brands, like an iron symbol, and so it's used in shipping as well. Yeah.
When anything visual, whether actually a logo or a mark, would have helped in an era where everybody didn't read.
Of course, yeah. I think literacy is another important component, and that's certainly one you can't ignore, because the inherent visual symbology of the logo, right, is something that transcends words. If you see the Nike swoosh today, that is arguably universal, right? You don't necessarily need to see it in another language to know that it means Nike, and certainly someone who's familiar with the brand in terms of its global market today would recognize it. So yeah, I would say yes, it does transcend literacy. in a way, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. You were a wonderful audience.
Thank you to Jennifer Black for fabulous. I feel like I learned a lot. We were talking about, in case you didn't show up, what I remembered from my college history class on advertising back in the 80s, and I don't think I could have done it. So thank you, saving us that horrible moment. This has been wonderful. Our books, Head House Books has Jennifer's book in the back for you to buy for yourself. Someone else you know who maybe is in the advertising, communications, marketing industry, maybe someone who's newly graduated and thinking about going into this field. Anybody else you know, I always encourage, buy a book. That's the best present you can give to anybody. So they'll be right back there, and Jennifer will sign it for you. And thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our future programs. Just a reminder, support our spring appeal. Become a member if you're not a member, because we'd love to see more of you here. And have a great evening.